you, we're going to do it. It's a free service for you. And in that way, you also ensure that there's consistency across the country.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. Monsieur Fortin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Alors,
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I have 90 seconds, so I'll try and be as quick as possible. There's a question that I've been mulling over. We know that currently there's a war on the Gaza Strip. We know that international opinion, and I won't delve into a critique on this, but international opinion is not unanimous in terms of who to support. Now, today, we're focusing on the issue of anti-Semitism in Canada and the fears expressed by the Jewish community in Canada. Ms. Lyons, very quickly, if I could hear from you, in your opinion, what's currently playing out in Israel and in Gaza, does it have an impact on the incidents that we're bearing witness to in Canada?
Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, that it does have an impact. And again, I would say that conflicts that happen in many parts of the world, and I have been present for a number of those, need not end up in our backyard with us fighting with one another. That is not what Canadian values suggest, nor is that who Canadians are. And just lastly, I would say that we have not had our brains shrunken, neither by COVID nor by social media. We are capable of holding two thoughts in our mind and soul at the same time. It is possible to be pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian at the same time. Canadians have that capacity.
merci, Madame Lyons. Monsieur Marceau, en quelques secondes, de votre avis, est-ce qu'on doit...
Mr. Marceau, in a couple of seconds, please. Should one make a distinction between the criticisms levelled against... Unfortunately, our time has run out, sir. But, if you could submit the response in writing. The interpreter had not finished interpreting the question, unfortunately.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think good government policy, no matter what department, depends on solid data. And Mr. Robertson, I'd like to turn to you, B'nai B'rith. I mean, your organization provides an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. But if your organization, you yourself, were to look at the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada and the way it collects data, are there any recommendations you would like to see in this committee's report, on the quality, the quantity, the frequency? Do you have anything you'd like to see this committee recommend?
Canada's data has been similar to ours, and I believe that to me indicates that Statistics Canada is on the right track. What I would like to see, and what I believe would be helpful, specifically when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism on campuses, is the further collection of data, both qualitative and quantitative, about Jewish experience specifically on campuses. I think that that's something that's lacking, and I think that funding to enable an organization or the federal government to do that will help us really understand just how critical the situation on campuses across Canada is.
Mr. Marceau, I saw your hand.
So very quickly, Statistics Canada, yes, gets good data, but it's always a year behind. Like when you talk with the U.S. and France and Britain, they can get the information in basically, if not a weekly, at least a monthly way, and this helps everybody, including decision makers, and that is something that Canada should be able to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our witnesses. This concludes this panel. I want to thank you all for coming today and specifically for providing us specific recommendations that will help us. Again, if there's anything that you feel you have not been able to share with us, please send it to us in writing. Thank you very much. I'll suspend for 2 minutes in order to allow our panelists for the second round to either be tested or come to the front. Thank you very much. I am informed the sound test is done for the witness that is appearing by video conference, and I would ask the witnesses that are in the room to please take their seats. Thank you very much. Welcome to our witnesses for the second panel. We have with us today as individual Dr. James A. Diamond, by video conference, Josephine Wolf Lebovic, Chair of Jewish Study, University of Waterloo. Also, Dr. Ted Rosenberg, doctor, in his own capacity. And we have representatives from the Network of Engaged Canadian Academics, Dr. Deidre Butler, Associate Professor, and Dr. Carrie Cogan, Professor. I will ask each of the three, the two individuals and the one organization, to speak for up to 5 minutes. I will raise this when there's 30 seconds left, and I will let you know gently that time is up. And so we will commence right now with our first person that I have here on my document, who is appearing with us by video conference, and the sound has been tested and all is okay. So Dr. Diamond, the floor is yours for up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really am honored to address the committee, and thank you for inviting me to these very important deliberations on anti-Semitism. I sent a letter. I'll begin with my own personal encounter with one of these encampments at University of Toronto, and I hope you have that letter that I penned to the administration of the University of Toronto. So it was quite a shocking encounter that I had, and if you'll notice, my letter does not contain one single word about Jews, about Israel, about Gaza, nothing like that. I tried to actually pen a critique to the university about behavior, general behavior. But I must add that the only reason I could offer for having had that very kind of shocking, insulting, humiliating encounter was because I was visibly Jewish. That is, I was wearing a yarmulke or kippah on my head. I had come from a conference between members of different faiths at the Pontifical Institute, and the level of conversation could not have been more distinct. From the sublime to the obscene, I would say. And so I will, that's a bit about my encounter, what's going on there. I think what is happening is that many different causes, what people might call progressive causes, are being conflated with the situation in Israel, the current conflict. This is nothing new, by the way. This has gone on for decades. I was an undergrad, I'm showing my age, in 1973 at the University of Toronto, and the same things were happening, except I think you would add the toxic ingredient of social media now, which is another, I guess, factor that hopefully you'll take into consideration when you address problems of anti-Semitism. And so what's happened now is anti-Semitism has always operated under different guises, whether it was anti-Judaism, for instance, in its beginnings, whether it was racism, an anti-kind of race, with which anti-Semitism really culminated in during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, whether it was economics. Marx himself penned a treatise on Jews and money, an obscene treatise that Jews have been suffering from ever since. And it cuts across all spectrums, left, right, it doesn't matter. It is, I think, a unique form of, I wouldn't use racism. It is a unique form of discrimination. And so now, the way I see it, what's happening in the academy, what's happening with these encampments is now anti-Semitism has taken the form of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and it's been legitimized that way. That's not to say that you can't critique a government. You certainly can critique Israel, but the obsessive compulsive disorder, as you can see, that is solely focused on this particular conflict, for me, is inexplicable without that dimension. The dimension that distinguishes the state of Israel from all other states, it's its Jewish dimension. And I can't explain this this single-minded focus as opposed to far greater humanitarian crises, for instance, in the Sudan, that's happening now, by orders of magnitude, that gets nothing. So for me, as an academic, this is another form. I think the Vice President Fortin kind of asked this question at the end of the last session. It certainly is very inextricably tied, and I just want the committee to be attuned to, and the IRA definition brings that to the fore, that this is another guise of anti-Semitism, not all of it, not all critiques, but I think it explains a lot of what's going on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your opening comments. The letter that you referred to, we're checking on it. Once it's translated, it will be submitted to all members of the committee. Dr. Rosenberg, please.
I really feel honored to be here today. I feel the weight of Jewish physicians and healthcare workers across Canada who feel attacked and marginalized in our universities and hospitals. I feel the weight of the majority of Canadian Jews who have been shocked by the unprecedented outbreak of anti-Semitic Jew hatred and are demoralized by the inadequate response from our leaders. I feel the weight of thousands of Canadians who are appalled by the blatant hatred, harassment, and violence that has drowned out civil discourse and taken over our universities, streets, theaters, and shops. In January 2024, I resigned as an assistant professor from the faculty, UBC Faculty of Medicine, because I believe UBC, like most medical schools and universities across the country, has allowed naked Jew hatred to creep in, which has now become systemic. I'm a physician who's privileged to study and practice medicine for over 40 years. I've worked in remote Indigenous communities and public health and research and spent the past 20 years doing house calls for frail seniors. I love teaching and mentoring. Now, according to students and colleagues, like any supporter of Israel, I'm falsely labeled a racist who supports a white, European, settler, colonial, apartheid, genocidal regime that deliberately starves and ethnically cleanses populations and murders women and children. Can you think of anything more odious? How can any person of good conscience feel anything but contempt and hatred for any person who supports such a loathsome regime? That is who they say I am. In November 2023, demonizing accusations about the so-called Israeli settler colonial regime occupying and murdering Gazans for 75 years were circulated in a petition signed by 1/3 of the UBC medical school class. Similar false accusations of genocide were echoed by Jem Newman in his valedictorian speech at the U of M, my alma mater, to a standing ovation. In addition to accusations about murdering 35,000 Gazan women and babies, he also included accusations of intentionally bombing hospitals and deliberate murder of physicians and journalists. These were shared as facts, despite the Al Ali hospital bombing being discredited and a tragic civilian casualty figure being downgraded by 50% by the UN the week before his speech. Sadly, facts have become irrelevant, even in faculties of medicine that used to pride themselves on being evidence-based and scientific. UBC medical professors and senior residents posted light blood libels about organ trafficking, Christ-killing, and anti-Semitic conspiracies with impunity. They reposted demands that Zionist physicians, Jews like me, were racist and should be removed from the selection process for postgraduate resident positions. These are not innocuous political differences. How are Jewish physicians supposed to teach students who hold us in such contempt? Will Jewish patients be safe with physicians who call for wiping Israel off the map? Will physicians who despise Israel and call for academic boycott be willing to collaborate with Jewish colleagues over research or even patient care? I doubt I would be admitted to medical school in 2024. Do you want a healthcare system that prioritizes ideology, decentered and decolonized medicine over individual patient care? 284 physicians wrote a letter to the President and Dean Dermot Kelleher expressing concerns about harassment, blatant anti-Semitism, and a toxic, hyper-politicized environment. He refused to meet with us. We found out that anti-Semitism or Jew hatred are not officially recognized in the DEI search engine for vulnerable groups. This is despite a Canadian government 2023 document warning that the surge of anti-Semitic hate crimes on Canadian campuses. In addition to administration's tolerance of demonization, our concerns about Jew hatred were illegitimate. In fact, the Faculty of Medicine refused to acknowledge in their poster for International Holocaust Remembrance Day that the Holocaust was the anti-Semitic murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis. Our concerns were illegitimate. We were told it was a universal lesson, not particular to the Jews. The poster was only changed after threats from donors. We are also subjected to a double standard. There rightly is zero tolerance for homophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny, or anti-Black, anti-Indigenous discrimination. Every other group can define what they experience as systemic hatred, but for some reason, not the Jews. Somehow it's more complicated. Just like Ivy League presidents indicated, the calls for genocide against Jews on campus can be acceptable, that it's contextual. What about calls for genocide against Black or Indigenous people? Are they also contextual? Demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, the 3 Ds, are excellent indicators to determine when legitimate criticism of Jews and the State of Israel crosses into hatred. We are told by deans, presidents, and politicians that students are just expressing their right to free speech, venting their moral outrage, and participating in social justice activism. I'd like to remind them that after World War I, German students were also outraged by injustice and poverty. Russian students were outraged by the exploitation of workers. Chinese students were outraged by authority during the Cultural Revolution. And graduates from the Sorbonne, no less, the Khmer Rouge, were outraged by capitalism and Western colonialism. Where did this end? Now the students are outraged by Zionism.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. I will now ask the Network for Engaged Canadian Academics to share your 5 minutes, however you please. Thank you.
Thank you, merci. Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee, we thank you for the opportunity to share our insights and expertise about the state of anti-Semitism on Canadian campuses. My name is Deidre Butler. I'm an Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Carleton University.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Je m'appelle Carol.
Yes, Carrick Hogan. I'm a psychological professor at the University of Ottawa.
Network of Engaged Canadian Academics, NECA. NECA is a nonpartisan group of Jewish and non-Jewish academics united in our shared concerns about rising anti-Semitism on Canadian campuses. We are a Canadian network of more than 300 academics from 40 universities and colleges across all disciplines. We advocate for academic freedom, diverse perspectives, and an expansive understanding of inclusion. Anti-Semitism is flourishing on campuses. It has reached crisis levels and represents a serious threat to Canadian democracy. It should trouble us all.
We see the results of this crisis, especially since October 7th. For example, a Jewish student was called a dirty Jew by his lab partners. The student appealed for help. His professor instructed him to stop complaining. On one campus, graffiti depicted a Star of David on a scaffold with a swastika. On another, a Jewish student's mural that called for peace after October 7th was defaced with threats including, "I'm going to kill you." Posters advocating the return of hostages have been repeatedly ripped down and pins stuck in the eyes of a victim. A student organization distributed stickers on campus displaying a hand tossing a Molotov cocktail. A Canada-wide student club is calling for anonymous tips to identify faculty members, instructors, and courses that include, quote, Zionist narratives so they can, quote, keep our campus safe from Zionist perspectives. Jewish students often aren't reporting these incidents because university policies are not being applied and officials do not recognize anti-Semitism when it happens. This hostile climate is a threat not only to Jewish people, but to the core values of Canadian society. It undermines open dialogue, diversity of ideas, and the search for truth that makes our universities an essential part of a liberal democracy.
This isn't new. Its deep roots are evident in the speed, intensity, and acceleration of anti-Semitic hate. Canadian campuses began convulsing with anti-Semitic activity while Hamas terrorists were still in Israel slaughtering innocent civilians, long before Israel launched its military response. Many on campuses say they're not anti-Semitic, but merely anti-Zionist. You will even hear that a small minority of Jewish students and faculty share this view. Do not be fooled. Political criticism of Israel is absolutely acceptable and appropriate. Spend time in Israel and you will hear similar criticisms. A willingness to engage in criticism is core to Jewish values. However, this is not what we're seeing. Rather, calls for the violent erasure of the only Jewish state in the world, the erasure of the long history of Jewish people in this place, and claims that Israel is uniquely evil or categorically unfit to determine its own destiny is racist. And we see that overt racism in the campus examples we cited earlier and many, many others.
We see the damage done to students. They say they avoid certain courses, not because they cannot have hard conversations, but because their perspectives are rejected and belittled, and they are forced to use course materials that make lurid, false claims about Jews and Israelis, and that include data drawn from Hamas publications. Fellow students and their professors single them out to answer for the actions of the Israeli government. Academic freedom is supposed to encourage exploration of challenging ideas without fear of reprisal. This is crucial for intellectual growth. Yet departments have published statements claiming that the only correct position on this conflict is one that aligns itself with the destruction of Israel. Some even justify rape and murder as tools for liberation. Departments sign one-sided statements demonizing Israel, stifling alternative viewpoints, and imposing loyalty tests. Anti-Israel activists claim they are being silenced while cynically demanding boycotts of Israeli academics. Make no mistake, boycott and divestment are a threat to academic freedom and responsible university governance. Anti-Semitism presents a serious and urgent threat to campus culture and student safety. Our leaders must acknowledge and confront its ugliness, its new and evolving forms, and the harm it poses. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. We will now start with our round. Depending on timing, we'll see what happens after that. But we'll start with our first round for 6 minutes with Mr. Majonder, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your excellent contributions today. Apologies for the climate in which you have to appear before this committee. Dr. Diamond, perhaps I could start briefly with you. I only have 6 minutes, so I'm looking for a quick response. You set the table about the evolution of anti-Semitism over the ages, and it strikes me that you have concluded, sir, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism today. Would you agree with that, just to be precise?
Yes. Zionism, the definition of Zionism is kind of a Jewish liberation movement for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So if you are anti-Zionist, then for me, you are singling out the Jewish people of all other peoples to the right, singling them out as not having the right to a national homeland. In this case, perhaps one of the only indigenous peoples, it's ironic, to return to their homeland. There's always been a community of Jews always in Israel, and so yes.
Thank you, sir. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Just in the interest of time, the state of Israel is probably the most remarkable indigenous revival on planet Earth over the last 75 years. We saw recently, Dr. Diamond, that international courts have been weaponized against Jewish people and the state of Israel. Would you say, in your experience, that the ICJ shenanigans had a material impact in how Jewish life was impacted on Canadian campuses?
Absolutely. It's simply another kind of legitimization of this insidious form of anti-Semitism that I would call anti-Zionism. So what it does is it lends credibility to this phenomena that, for me, again, has unleashed another form of anti-Semitism that has morphed many, many times over the ages.
over the 90s, we saw the introduction of critical theory thinking, in which pluralism was used as a normative guise for moral relativism, for equivalencies. And in that same context was the birth of the International Criminal Court, which today we see being weaponized yet once again through its equivalencies against the democratic, law-abiding state of Israel, capable of implementing its own decisions and jurisprudence over war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression, versus the terrorist entity that is Hamas, which is not interested in any rule of law but the obliteration of an entire state, being backed by another state, the state of Iran. Do you fear for how the ICC is presently being weaponized against Canadian Jews and on across the Canadian Academy?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll let you give my perspective from an academic point of view. The encampment that is presently active in the University of Waterloo, my administration, I'll just read it to you if I can, just briefly, addressing the protesters' calls. This is a public communication. They are dialoguing with protesters about their demands for divestment from companies, complete severance from any academic or cultural institutional ties with Israeli institutions. Now, this is quite incredible to me. Freedom of expression, they're fine. I'm fine with that. But freedom of expression doesn't mean that I need to listen to your expression. To divest from Israeli academic institutions and citing what you just kind of mentioned, things like the ICJ or the ICC as supporting these demands would lead to to suppression of academic freedom, particularly targeting Jewish academics.
Thank you for that.
Particularly targeting Jewish academic institutions.
Thank you very much for saying that, sir, because I think now is a time in which we should be responding, as some of your colleagues have said, with rededication to the freedom of critical thinking rather than the indoctrination of critical theory. But perhaps I could close with this question. We're watching in the United States a bipartisan consensus emerging for sanctioning the ICC for how it is weaponizing terrorist propaganda against free-thinking people, and particularly our treasured Jewish communities across the Western world. Do you think Canada should consider something similar?
Absolutely. I'll just mention one particular facet of this seeking arrest warrants. You have Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, pinning up mugshots of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of the atrocities, alongside Netanyahu. Now, why was that done? I mean, they could have, let's say, sought arrest warrants for Sinwar a number of months ago. The evidence was there for everybody to see. All the news media had seen this. But yet, of course, this was carefully orchestrated to put a democratic regime that is fighting for its survival alongside a leader of a terrorist group that committed rapes, atrocities unimaginable. I've spoken to actually the group that sorry.
Dr. Diamond, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will now go to Mr. Housefather, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. You've brought some very important testimony. Dr. Rosenberg, if I were to ask you, on a whole, if you were to grade the universities in Canada, not singling out one university, but as a whole, on how they're handling anti-Semitism since October the 7th, what grade would you give them?
F. And I want to show you, I've got some posters here about some of the Jew hatred that is accepted in the Faculty of Medicine.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I think you're great for the moment.
I would say an F.
Thank you very much. Ms. Butler and Mr. Kagan?
I can respond. Come on. So I would say that they haven't shown up for class, they haven't turned in the assignments, and so we can't even grade them. That's where we're at.
Thank you. Dr. Diamond?
So I can speak in terms of my own institution. I think they've been trying to handle this. I wouldn't give them an F, but as I said in my last response, to actually dialogue and consider divestment, that is quite shocking to me. So on that particular issue, I would give them an F.
Thank you. Dr. Diamond, I don't think everybody had what you exactly experienced at the University of Toronto, and I want to read from an email that you sent to University of Toronto about what you experienced. A large group of what can only be described as masked thugs blocked my movement and maniacally and menacingly screamed obscenities at me, such as "Go back to your country, you will never get by me," followed by a string of vulgar expletives unworthy of repeating. Now, Dr. Diamond, how did that make you feel? Because I've heard that from many students and faculty members across the country that they're experiencing the same when walking around these encampments.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously that was, I mean, I'm an academic, a senior academic for many, many years. I've never been confronted this way. As a young man, I had various anti-Semitic incidents, but never in my career as an academic. And so it was humiliating. But it was also the only thing, as I said before, that could explain that kind of reaction, especially the shouts of "Go back to your country." I was born and raised in Canada. My parents are survivors. My in-laws are survivors of the Holocaust. They worked all their lives, and loved Canada for what it offered them. And when they said that to me, all that kind of came to my mind. And my thoughts were, is this all disintegrating? Are we reverting back to a situation that my parents perhaps faced?
Even know if they would have faced that, it's hurtful and it's anti-Semitic and it's happening across this country. Dr. Rosenberg, University of Manitoba, the biggest ever personal donation to the University of Manitoba, $30 million, was given by a philanthropist named Ernest Rady to name the medical school after his father, Max Rady. He recently complained to the school about the speech of the valedictorian at the medical school graduation, which he basically said the speech not only dishonored the memory of his father, but also disrespected and disparaged Jewish people as a whole. This is where the valedictorian chose to take the medical school graduation in front of many graduates and faculty who are Jewish and turn it into a diatribe against Israel. How does that, when that happens, Dr. Rosenberg, because you described very well what it made you feel like a faculty member, what happens to a Jewish faculty member or a Jewish student who's in that graduating class when that happens?
It's terrible. I can tell you when the petition went around from the UBC medical students, we felt like this massive gut punch. And worse than that, like the ovation that was heard at University of Manitoba, the silence from our colleagues, not only silence, but there were social media attacks on students who said they wouldn't sign the petition. It was terrible for us. And I can tell you as an academic, as someone who spent 20, 30 years teaching and loves teaching, I was truly afraid of an accusation of implicit harassment by these students, just by virtue of the fact that they may have found out that I'm Jewish and I support the state of Israel. And there's no way to defend ourselves against that harassment, that accusation. I'll make one last comment. I was in touch with physicians from Ontario yesterday, and over 110 physicians from Ontario who are academic physicians are almost certainly going to withdraw their affiliation with the University of Toronto because they are so ashamed. And what we're looking at is a medical system across Canada that will soon be Judenrein if this continues.
It's even more poignant in the sense that the school is named for a Jewish donor, that the Jewish community contributes so much to the medical community in Canada, and yet we feel shut out by these yelling and screaming and epithets and comments that simply attack us for identity as Zionists. And Ms. Butler, do you want to, Mr. Kagan, do you want to comment on that? I'll come back to you.
Do you want to?
Well, I think we just need to point something out that's really important, right? Which is now based on actual data about what we know about Jewish Canadians, right? So this is from Robert Brim's study that just came out last month that tells us that 91% of Canadian Jews would say that they support the state of Israel and the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. So we know that when people are attacking, people for their core identity, which is their connection with Israel, they are attacking the Jewish community.
And to the point of convocations, we're about to head into convocation ceremonies across Canada, and there's grave concern. At my own university in the fall, there was a very quick burst of pro-Palestinian celebration, which was felt very differently, of course, by the Jewish community who was there when it was only a few weeks after October 7th. And many people came.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now go to Mr. Fortin, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. And thank you very much, Doctors Diamond, Rosenberg, Butler and Cogan. Thank you for being with us today. It's an important study and your contributions are invaluable. Now, Mr. Diamond or Dr. Diamond, I'd like to come back to what you said a moment ago. I really appreciated the quote, i.e. that the freedom of expression does not necessarily include an obligation to listen to it. You're entirely right, spot on, I agree with you 100%, and I wanted to point that out right out of the gates. Now, as far as that issue is concerned, obviously we all agree, or I don't know anyone who disagrees with the fact that anti-Semitism is unacceptable. We are here to look at ways of improving things. Otherwise, it's much ado about nothing and it's not very productive. So we're looking for ways to improve the state of affairs, and it concerns me, how can we better protect religious freedom across Quebec and Canada? How can we protect freedom of expression, freedom of speech? And Mr. Diamond, or Dr. Diamond, if I could check in with you on this. If I understood correctly, what the Canadian Jewish community is calling for is religious freedom, respect of their religious beliefs, which is on an equal footing to that of all other religions. Or is there a specific thing that would be required for the Jewish community? Are you calling for the exact same approach to all, or a specific approach towards the Jewish community's religion?
Thank you. I can only I can't speak on behalf of the entire Jewish community in Canada, and what you said are perfectly just kind of ways of looking at anti-Semitism. I'll focus my concern on my own kind of area in the academic community and what I see this leading to. So that freedom of expression, freedom of religion, because after all, I think people make a mistake looking at Jews as just people who practice a religion. Jews are far more than that. They're a nation, they're a people, they're a culture. So from an academic viewpoint, if I can just mention one thing, as a result of all what's going on, there has been an astonishing range of discriminatory practices against Jewish academics. These include termination of scientific collaborations, cancellation of conference invitations, refusal to consider scholarly submissions to journals, rejections of promotion evaluations, and withdrawal of offers for academic appointments, among many other instances. So from my kind of narrow perspective, this is really a pernicious phenomenon, because what it's doing is it is a form of anti-Semitism that is suppressing academic freedom within the academy, which will have unbelievable ramifications for far beyond Jews as well, I think.
Merci, Monsieur Diamond.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. Therefore, in an ideal world, in an ideal Quebec or Canada, ideally, we should be able to talk about all issues, all philosophies, all religions, all ways of thinking freely, without the other party being obligated to listen or be in agreement. So at a university, in academia, when there's disagreement, well, that's normal. And not only is it normal, but it's healthy. It's what's desired. Everyone should be not only free to practice their religion, free to believe in what they want to believe. Do you agree with that affirmation, Mr. Diamond?
Absolutely. You actually described exactly how I conduct my classes. I have just a couple of rules in my classes. You don't make your point by raising your voice. You don't make your point by sloganeering. You make your point in civil discourse and offering cogent reasoning. Those are my rules in a class. And if you could do that, if you could abide by that, then we listen. I don't listen to demands, right? If a student says, I demand that you, right, subscribe to this opinion, then I probably will tell them maybe you could leave the classroom and we'll continue our discussion.
Merci, Monsieur Diamond. Il reste une minute.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. I have barely 1 minute left. Mr. Kogan, Dr. Kogan, on the same issue. I agree 100% with Professor Diamond. What we're seeing on the campuses is that it's, in fact, academic freedom that is being whittled down, and that is a problem across Canada in our campuses and universities. And I really have misgivings about the fact that there's only one way of looking at things in classrooms, and that doesn't afford freedom of expression or belief to others. Sir, Mr. Rosenberg, there's about 30 seconds left. Perhaps there's a bit of lag in the interpretation. Ms. Butler?
What Professor Kogan is saying is that in the university, we need to be arguing using evidence-based decision-making, using arguments that are based on reason, and we don't all have to agree with each other, but we have to be able to be civil with each other, and you don't have to subscribe to a belief to understand an argument. And without viewpoint diversity, we're only hearing one argument, and that's our problem right now.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur
Merci.
Fortin, Monsieur.
Désolé, Monsieur Rosenberg.
Sorry, Mr. Rosenberg. Sorry.
McGregor, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for joining us today and helping inform this committee on its study into this very difficult subject. In a perfect world, universities are a place where we should be able to have difficult conversations on a wide range of subjects. And I think all of our witnesses here have clearly differentiated between that and the vile hatred that exists for so many Jewish students in campuses across Canada. So thank you. I think your comments coming from the academic perspective do mirror and echo what this committee heard from students. So thank you for adding that important perspective. I think I'd like to turn my first question to the network of engaged Canadian academics. We're dealing with a number of jurisdictions here, federal and provincial. And so I guess one question I would have for you, this is the Justice Committee. We're ultimately making recommendations to the federal government. But is there anything that you would like to see additionally in how the federal government works with post-secondary education ministers of provincial governments? Is there anything missing in that relationship, anything the federal government could do to aid those ministers in the responsibilities that they have for post-secondary institutions within their respective provinces?
We have a few suggestions, of course. The first thing that I would say is that we lack really good data in terms of what's happening on our campuses. And partially that has to do with the reporting systems that exist on our campuses across Canada, where reports aren't being taken, they aren't being heard. If they're heard, they're not seeing anti-Semitism, and they're certainly not being counted as anti-Semitism. And so if you speak to university presidents and administrations and they say there's no problem, we are telling you there is a very serious problem. So we need good data, and it has to be unbiased data that everyone can accept as authentic and legitimate. I would then go to talk about EDI, but do you want to?
Sure, I can speak about that. I think we have an issue right now where, and in fact, we have submitted a grant to SHRC, actually, to look at this issue of the way that the equity, diversity, and inclusion frameworks that are on our campuses are not speaking to Jewish people, are not speaking to anti-Semitism, and in fact, in some cases, are using an ideological framework that divides the world in black and white, victimized, victimizer, right? Oppressed, oppressor. And this positioning and what happens is Jews get shoehorned into this framework inappropriately. It's an inappropriate application. And so I would say we need to strengthen these EDI frameworks and make sure that there's an inclusion of the Jewish experience and also of anti-Semitism in a way that actually will protect and recognize the Jewish experience.
Thank you. I just have to make two comments. First of all, anti-Semitism is not recognized at UBC Faculty of Medicine. If you go in their search engine, it doesn't exist. So how can you say there's a problem if it's not even doesn't exist? We're just, if you feel discrimination, make a complaint that you're discriminated, but don't say you're Jewish, it's Jew hatred or anti-Semitic. And there was just a survey that went around UBC this week for all the Faculty of Medicine. What group do you consider yourself? And at every single group except Jews. Second point I want to make about DEI, it's not just that, this is a very narrow definition of your Marvel universe of oppressors and oppressed, oppressors who could do no good and oppressed people who could do no wrong. It's also that as Jews, we have been cast as white, privileged, and also, worst of all, the apex oppressor. We support settler colonialism, which right now is the worst possible epithet that you could say against anyone in Canada. So that's where Jews stand right now.
Thank you for that. I went to university. My undergrad was at the University of Victoria, and I did my master's degree at Royal Roads, both on Vancouver Island. I guess the big difference, especially in my undergrad days, is we didn't have social media. And it is an incredibly different environment now on campuses with social media. The fact that, anyone could have their face live streamed out in public and immediately, your image is shared through social media accounts. There has been a lot of discussion at various federal committees on taking social media companies to task, making them accountable for their standards, for the algorithms that push people into these dark corners. I know this intimately because I'm a member of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We have delved deeply into ideologically motivated violent extremism. We have had expert testimony on how social media companies make money off of this algorithms pushing people. Can you just talk a little bit from your perspectives as academics? Is there anything more that you would like to see this committee recommend with respect to how we make sure social media companies are accountable for the terms and conditions on their platforms? Because we have to remember, these are not public spaces, they are private spaces, and they are in the ownership of a company who is trying to make money.
So my very quick question is to pay attention to the ways in which the problems we're seeing on campuses around anti-Semitism are coordinated. And they're coordinated through social media. The messages, the chants that we are finding so egregious and frightening as Jews in our community are coming across social media and circulating. So I know we're running out of time, but that's the issue really, is that it becomes a place to amplify hate.
Thank you very much. I am going to do a second round, and we're going to go 3-3, 1.5, 1.5. I will be strict on time as much as I can, so thank you. And I will begin with Ms. Landsman, please.
Thanks. Dr. Rosenberg, first of all, thank you for everybody for your testimony. And if you have any documents, please share them with the committee. That's Dr. Rosenberg, you said something about DEI, and there's been some victories against DEI, let's say at MIT, where statements are no longer required in hiring practices. Do you believe that this is salvageable at university or no? And I have a follow-up question, given you also practice as well as teach.
Okay, first of all, I'd say that historically and presently there is discrimination, against very vulnerable groups, Indigenous people, people of color, homophobia, etc. So that is real. That's real. The question is DEI the answer? And what I've seen in my experience with DEI, it's been more divisive than uniting people. I think all people in Canada agree that we want to, eradicate discrimination and hatred, against group hatred. But I think, personally, I feel that DEI is oversimplified everything and made it and increased the divisions.
I'll ask you, look, I couldn't agree more, and I frankly think it's embarrassment for the universities, their presidents, their governing councils, and everybody associated with the institution and the governance of those institutions to allow what is happening right now on those campuses. I'd be embarrassed as a student, as an alumni of the institution that I went to, but I have a question specifically about meritocracy. And given that you practice medicine as well as teach it, do you think that that with the perversion of DEI in all of our institutions, that you are getting the right medical students into schools, and that patients are being served accordingly, given the structures of DEI that have been imposed on universities over the last 20 years?
Okay, I just want to add one more thing about the DEI. You know, one of the problems with the DEI and the identity politics is intersectionality, which causes the piling on. It causes the social media epidemics and the amplification. And that's what we're seeing. Now, in terms of are we able to select appropriate candidates, right now at University of British Columbia, they said that there are certain groups of people who are preferentially going to be accepted. People of color, Indigenous people, LGBTQ, etc. Right? They preferentially get into medical schools, and they also take people who, based on their social justice experience. Now, can you imagine if I said my social justice experience was volunteering on a kibbutz, or with Magen David Adom, or spending grade 10 in an agricultural school? There's no way I would get in to UBC today.
Just a quick follow-up. Are we getting the best doctors and, as a result, the best patient care? Just a yes or no.
So,
yeah, sorry.
if you want to say yes or no, go ahead. Otherwise, I would love it if you would submit that in writing.
I would refer to Dr. Philip Berger's article in the Toronto Star, which said that we're making a huge mistake. We're selecting people based on identity rather than qualification.
So, thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. Ms. de Bruzen, please.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up a little bit because Dr. Rosenberg just referred to intersectionality, and I was curious to raise this issue with Dr. Butler, if I may, which is there is a bit of a perception that Jewish people are all one homogeneous group, one and the same. But there are some groups on campus that may be experiencing anti-Semitism in different ways. And so particularly when I'm talking about queer youth, for example, can you talk a little bit about what that experience might be and what we need to do to better also protect students with intersectional identities?
Thank you so much. So I'm a Jewish woman. I'm a feminist professor. So I have an intersectional identity too, and it's something that's very important to my work. It's a tool like any other. It isn't a demonic tool. It can be a very powerful one. So when we're thinking about queer students on campus, LGBTQT+ students, what's happening if they're Jewish is they have their Jewish identity, but they also have their queer identity. And those things should work beautifully together, and they should be places where they can strengthen each together. What's happened is they're excluded from progressive spaces. We're forced to have loyalty tests of declaring you're not a Zionist, that you repudiate the state of Israel. And we know that these are the students who are facing real challenges in terms of their social integration, in terms of their mental health. They are some very vulnerable students. They need all the support they can get. And so their exclusion from those spaces is particularly painful and egregious.
I don't have much time, so I just wanted to quickly also speak to either Dr. Kung or Butler. You put, as part of the Network of Engaged Canadian Academics, a REACT model for universities, which I understand is reach out to Jewish students, faculty, and staff, engage with the diversity of Jewish life, act systematically to address anti-Semitism, call out anti-Semitism, and teach about history and legacy. If you have, in like the final minute, first of all, to submit any materials you have on that, but also to speak to why you think this is important.
So we will be happy to submit it. I think we may have already, actually. So this was actually developed by Professor Lilach Maron, who is a member of NECA, as part of her presentation on EDI that she did earlier this year to educate EDI members. The point of that is to think about how EDI can be strengthened to better include Jews and anti-Semitism. It is a framework that's designed to support people who are vulnerable and who need, who are equity-seeking groups. So how do we deal with those groups? How do we include Jews when they're not included? If you look at EDI policies across Canada at universities, Jew anti-Semitism, Judaism they're not even in the paperwork.
Thank you for that. Monsieur Fortin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. We have 90 seconds. So, in 10 seconds, if I asked each of you, please, what do you expect from us? We are federal legislators. We oversee federal legislation. We don't intervene out on the ground, obviously. What do you expect of us? Mr. Kogan.
We need to strengthen academic freedom by ensuring that there are actually a diverse set of voices on our campuses. That's one thing that needs to happen. We need to strengthen EDI. We just heard about how we can include that. We need training. We need training on anti-Semitism. We need to make sure that our deans, our provosts, our chairs actually understand what it is.
Merci. Madame Butler.
Dr. Butler.
I would add to all of that also to take seriously the policies and procedures that already exist, the laws that exist in our country and in our provinces that can address these issues and have not been applied.
Dr. Rosenberg.
I think that all our leaders need to speak out against demonizing speech all the time, and I think they need to model behavior that is compassionate, empathetic, and recognize that there are always two parties when there's a conflict.
Merci. Dr. Diamond.
Dr. Diamond.
Sorry, I would echo the previous comments, and I would just say if the federal government has any input into divestment policies of universities, they should really ensure that they're not discriminatory.
Merci, Monsieur Diamond. Merci tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you to all the witnesses. I vote for equality for all religions, all thought, ways of thinking.
It's for the final 1.5.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's obvious that every Canadian student, no matter what their background, needs to enjoy the right to feel safe in a safe and welcoming learning environment where they can go about unobstructed and enjoy that academic freedom, which I think so many witnesses have underlined is so important to our democracy as a whole. I think out of this committee's studies and what we've heard from witnesses, there are obviously going to be some short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations to the government. But in the immediate term, given that the security is so absent for so many Jewish students and for academics, what would you like to see to sort of try and bolster the security for Jewish students presently? Is there anything that you'd like to see us recommend to the federal government?
So I interview Holocaust survivors, and one of the survivors I interviewed many years ago was David Shento, and he said, when people say they're going to kill you and they hate you, believe them. So I would ask anyone who has any authority and leadership to lead on this issue. When you're hearing things on our universities